In the humid, dimly lit intelligence rooms of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a ghost was taking shape. It was a ghost made of steel and fire, a phantom that haunted the dark waters of the Solomon Islands. The year is 1942, and the brutal attritional struggle for Guadalcanal is reaching a fever pitch. Reports, fragmented and laced with a kind of shell-shocked awe, are flooding in from the fleet. They speak of a terror in the night, a singular American warship that defies all known laws of naval gunnery. Sailors, veterans of Tsushima and the Yellow Sea, men who had drilled for years in the art of nocturnal combat, describe an unbelievable spectacle. From the blackness of the sea, a single cruiser erupts. But this is no ordinary barrage. This is a continuous roaring wall of fire. Muzzle flashes, brilliant and blinding, don't flicker. They merge, creating a solid, incandescent line of light stretching hundreds of feet along the ship's deck. It is, they say, as if the Americans have mounted a gargantuan machine gun on a cruiser's hull. On the floor of Iron Bottom Sound, the evidence is irrefutable. Wreckage of some of the Empire's finest warships, heavy cruisers, nimble destroyers, lies twisted and broken, sent to their graves by a storm of 6-inch shells. The numbers being reported are simply impossible. In one engagement, estimates suggest this single vessel fired over 1,500 rounds in under an hour. Senior officers, men who have dedicated their lives to naval ballistics, exchange looks of disbelief and dawning fear. They know the mechanics of their own weapons intimately. The complex dance of hoisting shells and powder from the magazines, ramming them into the breech, training the massive guns, and firing. It is a symphony of muscle and machinery that has a hard physical limit. The finest, most drilled gun crews in the Imperial Japanese Navy, men who considered themselves artists of destruction, could barely achieve half that rate of fire, and even then, only in short, unsustainable bursts. The implications are terrifying. The thought drains the color from their cheeks. Have the Americans, in their industrial fury, achieved the impossible? Have they perfected a fully automatic, belt-fed naval cannon, a 6-inch machine gun? Or is it something else, something even more advanced, more alien to their understanding of warfare? This mysterious ship, this fire-spitting beast of the Solomons, is more than just a formidable opponent. It is a symbol of a terrifying technological gap, a specter that threatens to undo years of Japanese naval doctrine, training, and hard-won expertise in the art of fighting at night. They give it a name, a moniker born of fear and disbelief, the machine gun cruiser. What these Japanese officers could not have known was that the legend they were creating was both true and, at the same time, a profound misinterpretation of the threat they faced. The ship, the USS Helena, did not carry some mythical automatic cannon. Her secret was not a single piece of miraculous hardware, but a convergence of 3 powerful forces, a perfect storm of design, human skill, and a revolutionary technology that was about to change naval warfare forever. Her story is not merely the chronicle of a single vessel. It is the story of how an entire paradigm of war was shattered in the dark, blood-soaked waters of the South Pacific. Our central thesis is this: the legend of the USS Helena, the machine gun cruiser, was forged not simply by her astonishing rate of fire, but by her unprecedented ability to apply that firepower with deadly precision in conditions that left her enemies blind and bewildered. She was the physical embodiment of a technological revolution, a floating prototype for a new era where information, the ability to see in the dark, was becoming a weapon more powerful than armor or the caliber of a gun. Her journey, from the drafting tables of a nation constrained by treaties to the fiery crucible of the Pacific War, demonstrates how innovation, born from necessity and perfected under fire, could render decades of traditional naval doctrine obsolete. The story of the Helena is the story of America's painful but rapid evolution from a reactive naval power into the technologically dominant force that would ultimately win the war. She proves that the decisive factor in modern warfare is not just the strength of the sword, but the sharpness of the eye that guides it. To understand how this one ship could become such a terrifying enigma, we must first travel back in time, to an era of fragile peace, simmering tensions, and the international agreements that, paradoxically, would set the stage for the creation of one of the most lethal fighting ships of the Second World War. We must go back to a world where naval power was measured in the size of guns and the thickness of steel, a world utterly unprepared for a ship that could see in the dark. The story of the USS Helena is the story of how that world was irrevocably broken. It is a tale of how a ship, designed to the letter of a law meant to limit warfare, became an instrument of its unprecedented escalation. It is a story of ingenuity, sacrifice, and the brutal, unforgiving nature of technological surprise on the battlefield. And it begins, not with a bang, but with the stroke of a pen. In the 2 decades following the war to end all wars, the great naval powers of the world were caught in a delicate and ultimately doomed balancing act. The collective trauma of the First World War had given rise to a powerful wave of pacifism and a desperate desire to prevent another such cataclysm. This desire was codified in a series of naval disarmament treaties, beginning with the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and followed by the London Naval Treaties of 1930 and 1936. On paper, these agreements were monuments to enlightened diplomacy. They were designed to halt the ruinously expensive naval arms races that had contributed to the outbreak of the Great War. They set strict limits on the number of capital ships, battleships, and aircraft carriers that each nation could possess and capped their size and armament. But beneath this veneer of international cooperation, the old rivalries simmered. The treaties, intended to create parity, instead created a new kind of competition, a competition of innovation and exploitation of loopholes. This was the world that gave birth to the USS Helena. It was an era dominated by a central myth, a prevailing military doctrine that held naval combat to be the exclusive domain of the battleship. The thinking was simple and had been proven, it was thought, for centuries. Victory at sea belonged to the fleet with the biggest guns and the thickest armor. The ideal naval engagement was a daylight brawl, a slugging match between colossal dreadnoughts pounding each other into submission from miles away. The aircraft carrier was still a largely unproven novelty, and the cruiser was seen as a supporting actor, a scout for the battle fleet, a protector of convoys, or a raider of enemy commerce. The 1930 London Naval Treaty inadvertently shifted the focus of this hidden arms race directly onto the cruiser. While battleship construction was put on a holiday, the treaty attempted to regulate cruisers by splitting them into 2 categories: heavy cruisers, armed with guns no larger than 8 inches in caliber, and light cruisers, with guns of 6 inches or less. Both were limited to a displacement of 10,000 tons. To the treaty's authors, this seemed a logical way to curb the growth of these powerful vessels. To naval architects around the world, it was a challenge. How could one build the most powerful warship possible while remaining within the strict confines of 10,000 tons? The American response, initially, was the construction of a series of heavy cruisers armed with 8-inch guns. But across the Pacific, the Empire of Japan, a nation feeling constrained and disrespected by the treaty ratios it viewed as unfair, was thinking differently. Japanese naval doctrine was predicated on the assumption of a decisive battle against the numerically superior U.S. Pacific Fleet. To win this battle, they needed an edge. They sought it in 2 areas: superior torpedo technology, culminating in the peerless Type 91 Long Lance torpedo, and a mastery of night fighting. The Japanese trained their crews relentlessly for nocturnal combat, believing that under the cover of darkness, they could ambush, confuse, and cripple the American battle line before the main engagement even began. Their expertise was unmatched. They were the undisputed masters of the dark. It was within this strategic framework that Japan laid down the Mogami-class cruisers. Publicly, they were declared as light cruisers, adhering to the 10,000-ton limit and armed with 6-inch guns. But this was a carefully constructed deception. American naval intelligence received troubling reports. The Megamis were rumored to carry not the standard 8 or 9 6-inch guns, but a staggering 15, arranged in 5 triple turrets. More alarmingly, the ships were secretly designed to have these turrets swapped out for twin 8-inch gun turrets at a moment's notice, transforming them overnight into some of the most powerful heavy cruisers in the world. The 10,000-ton displacement limit was also a fiction. Their true weight was closer to 13,000 tons. This cheater ship sent a shockwave through the U.S. Navy's General Board. America, still deeply isolationist and weary of foreign entanglements, was determined not to be outgunned. If Japan was going to build a light cruiser with 15 6-inch guns, then America would have to match it. This decision marked a pivotal shift in American naval design. Instead of viewing the 6-inch gun as an inferior weapon, designers began to see an opportunity. An 8-inch shell was heavy and powerful, but it was slow to load and fire. A 6-inch shell, while lighter, could be handled much more quickly. What if, they reasoned, a rapid-fire barrage of numerous smaller shells could be more destructive than a slower volley of larger ones? It was a theory of volume over sheer power, a hailstorm against a hammer blow. This philosophy gave birth to the Brooklyn class of light cruisers. The 9th and final ship of this class, laid down at the New York Naval Shipyard in December 1936, was to be the USS Helena, designated CL-50. She was a physical manifestation of this new doctrine. At 607 feet long, she was a sleek, powerful vessel. Her 5 triple turrets, 3 forward and 2 aft in a superfiring arrangement, gave her the same 15-gun broadside as her Japanese rivals. These guns could hurl 130-pound armor-piercing shells over 15 miles, and crucially, were designed for a high rate of fire, a theoretical 10 rounds per minute per gun. This was the mechanical foundation of the machine gun cruiser legend. But a weapon is only as good as the hand that wields it. Aboard the Helena, the theory of rapid fire was transformed into a relentless, obsessive practice. Her gun crews trained with a fervor that bordered on mania. They drilled endlessly, shaving seconds, then fractions of seconds, off their loading times. They developed a rhythm, a mechanical ballet of muscle and coordination that turned each of her 5 massive turrets into a high-speed factory of destruction. They moved with a stopwatch efficiency, a seamless flow of men and machinery dedicated to a single purpose, putting as much steel on a target as quickly as humanly possible. It was this human element, this relentless pursuit of perfection, that would later create the illusion of an automatic weapon. They weren't just sailors, they were artisans of volley fire. Commissioned in September 1939, just as the world tipped into the abyss of another world war, Helena was the state-of-the-art. Her 4 Parsons turbines could generate 100,000 horsepower, pushing her sleek hull through the water at over 32 knots, fast enough to keep pace with destroyers. But for over a year, her war was one of drills and exercises. Transferred to the seemingly safe anchorage of Pearl Harbor in October 1940, her crew of 888 men settled into a routine of gunnery practice in the placid Hawaiian waters, honing their skills, blissfully unaware that their ship, a vessel born from the quiet anxieties of a treaty-bound world, was about to face its first, and nearly its last, great test. The antagonist in this story was not yet a fleet or a rival nation. It was a myth, the myth of American isolation, the myth of peace in the Pacific. And on a tranquil Sunday morning, that myth was about to be shattered by the roar of aircraft engines and the scream of falling bombs. The turning point was at hand. December 7th, 1941. The date is seared into the consciousness of a nation, a day of infamy that propelled a reluctant America into the heart of the Second World War. For the crew of the USS Helena, it was the day their world literally exploded. As the sun rose over Oahu, she lay moored at the 1010 dock on Ford Island. It was a berth of consequence, the spot normally occupied by the flagship of the Pacific Fleet, the battleship USS Pennsylvania. But the Pennsylvania was in dry dock for maintenance, and by a simple twist of fate, the Helena had taken her place. This seemingly minor detail of naval logistics would place her directly in the crosshairs of history. Beside her, tied to her starboard side, was the aging mine layer USS Oglala, a relic from another era. At 7:57 a.m., the tranquil morning was broken. Signalman First Class C.A. Flood, his eyes scanning the sky from habit, spotted a formation of aircraft approaching. But there was something wrong. These were not the familiar silhouettes of American planes. Having recently served on the Asiatic station, he instantly recognized the Rising Sun insignia. He alerted the officer of the deck, Ensign William W. Jones. The reaction was instantaneous. There was no hesitation, no moment of disbelief. Jones slammed the general alarm, his voice cutting through the ship's announcement system with chilling clarity. "Japanese planes bombing Ford Island. Man all battle stations. Break out service ammunition." The words were still echoing across the decks when the first wave of Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers descended like birds of prey. One pilot, streaking low over the harbor, saw the large, cruiser-sized vessel in the Pennsylvania's prestigious berth and identified it as a prime target. He released his weapon, a specially modified Type 91 aerial torpedo, equipped with wooden fins to allow it to run true in the shallow waters of the harbor. The torpedo sliced through the water, passing directly underneath the shallow-drafted Oglala, its target locked on the far more substantial hull of the Helena. The impact was catastrophic. The torpedo slammed into Helena's starboard side almost exactly amidships, 18 feet below the waterline. It struck one of her most vulnerable points, the engineering spaces. A colossal pillar of water, oil, and steel erupted skyward. The force of the explosion was indescribable. The ship lurched violently, her steel plates groaning in protest. Below decks, it was hell on earth. The forward engine room and an adjacent boiler room flooded almost instantly, with a churning slurry of seawater and fuel oil. The blast had come just 3 minutes after the general quarters alarm. Men were still scrambling through passageways, racing to their battle stations when the torpedo hit. Many were caught in the blast, killed instantly. Others were trapped in compartments that were suddenly plunged into suffocating darkness as electrical cables were sheared in two. In that moment of chaos and terror, the ship could have died. A lesser crew might have panicked. A lesser design might have failed. But this was Helena's first great test, and her crew met it not with fear, but with a furious, disciplined rage. In the flooded compartments, Chief Water Tender Westbrook, ignoring the mortal danger, waded through chest-deep, oil-slicked water to secure vital boiler parts, preventing a catastrophic explosion that could have ripped the ship apart. Damage control teams, working in near-total blackness, fought and extinguished multiple electrical fires sparking from severed circuits. The ship was grievously wounded, powerless and sinking, but she was not out of the fight. On her decks, her gunners, the same men who had drilled relentlessly in the calm Hawaiian seas, now put their training to the test against a living, breathing enemy. They threw open the ammunition lockers, and when the locks proved too slow, they simply smashed them open with hammers. A torrent of ammunition began to flow to the guns. For the next hour and a half, Helena's anti-aircraft batteries became a volcano of defensive fire. Her 5-inch dual-purpose guns, her 1.1-inch Chicago piano quad mounts, and her 50-caliber machine guns threw a blistering curtain of steel into the sky. Her gunners poured out approximately 375 5-inch rounds, 3,000 1-inch rounds, and 5,000 50-caliber rounds. Her barrage was so intense, so concentrated, that multiple Japanese bomber formations were seen to break off their attack runs rather than fly through the wall of flak she created. The concussion from the torpedo that had crippled Helena also proved fatal to her smaller neighbor, the Oglala. The shock wave had sprung the old mine layer's hull plates, and she began taking on water rapidly. Even as their own ship was fighting for its life, Helena's crew transformed their vessel into a fortress and a supply depot for the entire harbor. They shared their ammunition reserves with ships whose own magazines were inaccessible. 25,000 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition went to the crippled battleship California. They even sent ammunition and machine gun belting machines to shore-based gun positions, becoming a linchpin of the harbor's desperate defense. When the last wave of Japanese planes disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind a scene of fire, smoke, and ruin, the USS Helena was still afloat. She was heavily damaged, with 31 of her crew killed or mortally wounded. The Oglala beside her had capsized and sunk, but Helena had survived. More than that, she had fought back with a ferocity that earned her an official credit for shooting down 6 enemy aircraft, one of the highest tallies of any ship present that day. She had proven that even in the face of a perfectly executed surprise attack, a well-trained crew and rapid, accurate gunfire could make a profound difference. This event, her near sinking at Pearl Harbor, was the crucial turning point, the inciting incident that would transform Helena from a very good ship into a legendary one. Her survival was the first, most critical domino. Had she sunk, her story would have been just another tragic footnote to December 7th. But because she survived, she was given a second life. 2 days later, she was moved into dry dock number 2 for emergency repairs. A massive steel patch was welded over the torpedo hole, and by the end of the month, she was refloated. But the Navy had bigger plans for her than a simple patch job. She was sent back to the Mare Island Naval Shipyard near San Francisco. Here, the U.S. Navy, now fully engaged in a two-ocean war and desperate for any technological edge, made a fateful decision. Helena would not just be repaired, she would be remade. She became a test bed for the most advanced electronic systems the United States possessed. She was fitted with the new SG surface search radar, a revolutionary device that could paint a remarkably clear picture of ships on the surface, even in total darkness or thick fog, at ranges far beyond what the human eye could see. She received SC air search radar to detect incoming aircraft. Most importantly, her guns were linked to the new FC and FD fire control radars. These systems could take the data from the search radar, lock onto a specific target, and feed continuous, precise aiming information directly to the guns. For the first time, a ship could deliver its full broadside with devastating accuracy at an enemy it could not see at all. When the USS Helena sailed out of Mare Island in the summer of 1942, she was a new kind of warship. She was a ghost, a specter in the machine. She was the future of naval warfare. The torpedo that had nearly killed her had, in a stroke of incredible irony, become the catalyst for her rebirth as something far more deadly. The Japanese attack had shattered the myth of American invulnerability, but in the fires of Pearl Harbor, it had also forged a weapon that would, in turn, shatter their own myth of night-fighting supremacy. The stage was now set for the ultimate confrontation, a series of brutal nocturnal battles where Helena's newfound ability to see in the dark would be put to the ultimate test. The autopsy of a legend often reveals that the truth is far more complex and fascinating than the myth. The moniker machine gun cruiser suggested a simple, brute force advantage, but the reality of how USS Helena earned that name is a forensic study in the new art of technological warfare, a story of how invisible pulses of radio waves became as deadly as any armor-piercing shell. The laboratory for this new science of naval combat was the dark, treacherous stretch of water in the Solomon Islands, soon to be known as Iron Bottom Sound. By October 1942, the Guadalcanal campaign was a desperate slugging match. The U.S. Marines held the critical Henderson Field by day, but at night, the Imperial Japanese Navy owned the sea. Night after night, the Tokyo Express, fast-moving flotillas of cruisers and destroyers, would race down the channel known as the Slot to bombard the airfield and deliver troops and supplies. On the night of October 11th, American intelligence detected one such force. 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers under Rear Admiral Iritomo Goto, tasked with obliterating Henderson Field. To intercept them, the U.S. Navy sent Task Force 64 under Rear Admiral Norman Scott, a force of 4 cruisers, including Helena, and 5 destroyers. What followed was the Battle of Cape Esperance, and it would be Helena's coming-out party. Scott, commanding from his flagship USS San Francisco, made a critical, though understandable error. His flagship was not equipped with the new SG radar. As his force steamed in a single column through the pitch-black night, he was effectively blind. Aboard the Helena, however, the world was crystal clear. At 11:25 p.m., her radar operators got their first contact. Goto's squadron, over 13 nautical miles away. In Helena's Combat Information Center, a ghostly green line painted a precise picture of the enemy's course, speed, and formation. They tracked every movement as the range closed, feeding a steady stream of information to their captain, Gilbert Hoover. On the bridge of the San Francisco, Admiral Scott knew nothing. By a stroke of pure luck, a course change ordered by Scott placed his column in the perfect tactical position to cross the T of the Japanese formation, allowing his ships to bring their full broadsides to bear while the enemy could only reply with their forward guns. Yet, he still didn't know the enemy was there. By 11:45 p.m., the Japanese were only 5,000 yards away, point-blank range for naval guns. Helena's lookouts could now make out the dark shapes of the enemy's ships with their own eyes. Captain Hoover, knowing he had a perfect firing solution, sent a standard procedural request to the flagship. Interrogatory Roger, a coded phrase meaning, "Are we clear to open fire?" Here, communication, the perennial fog of war, intervened. Scott, confused by conflicting reports and still not convinced he was facing the enemy, replied simply, "Roger," intending only to acknowledge Hoover's message. But Hoover interpreted it as the confirmation he was waiting for. He gave the order. At 11:46 p.m., Helena's 15 6-inch guns erupted in a blinding, deafening cataclysm. A torrent of shells, guided by the unerring vision of her fire control radar, screamed across the water and slammed into the unsuspecting Japanese flagship, the heavy cruiser Ioba. The Japanese were caught in a state of complete and utter shock. They believed they were sneaking up on the Americans, only to be ambushed themselves. The general melee erupted, a chaotic brawl in the dark. But for Helena, it was not chaotic. While other American ships fired star shells to illuminate the enemy, inadvertently silhouetting themselves as perfect targets in the process, Helena needed no such light. In fact, an early enemy hit wiped out her searchlight platform, a blessing in disguise. As one officer later recalled, whenever any ship turned on her searchlights, everybody shot at her. Helena, deprived of the temptation, relied solely on her radar. She was a phantom, firing with lethal accuracy from the darkness. Her gunners, honed by months of relentless training, unleashed the furious rate of fire that would become their trademark. They shifted targets with ruthless efficiency, mauling the cruiser Furutica until it was a burning wreck, then turning their attention to the destroyer Fubuki, sending it to the bottom. The Battle of Cape Esperance was a stunning American victory, a desperately needed morale boost after the humiliating defeat at the Battle of Savo Island 2 months prior. The ripple effect was immediate. For the U.S. Navy, it was the first concrete proof that their technological investment could overcome Japan's vaunted night-fighting prowess. For the Japanese, it was the beginning of the machine gun cruiser myth, a terrifying encounter with an enemy who could see when they could not. Just 1 month later, Helena would face an even more brutal test. On the night of November 12th, the Japanese mounted a massive effort to finally destroy Henderson Field. Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe led a powerful force that included 2 fast battleships, Hii and Kirishima. In their way stood a hastily assembled American force under Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan. In a tragic repetition of Scott's mistake, Callahan chose the USS San Francisco as his flagship, again leaving the force's best eyes. The SG radar-equipped Helena relegated to the rear of the formation. At 1:24 a.m. on November 13th, history repeated itself. Helena's radar picked up Abe's force at over 13 nautical miles. Again, she tracked them perfectly. Again, her admiral remained blind. The two fleets, sailing directly towards each other in the blackness, interpenetrated. What followed was not a battle. It was a bar fight in a dark alley with shotguns. It became one of the most savage, confused, point-blank naval actions in history. Ships slammed into each other, firing at silhouettes just hundreds of yards away. In this vortex of chaos, Helena was an island of clarity. While other ships fired blindly into the smoke and at friendly vessels, her radar gave her a clear picture. Her gunners engaged target after target, the destroyer Akatsuki, which exploded under concentrated fire, the destroyer Amatsukaze, and a trio of other destroyers, Murasame, Asagumo, and Samidari. She weaved through the burning hulks of friend and foe, her rapid-fire guns contributing to the maelstrom that ultimately savaged the Japanese force and, most critically, saved Henderson Field. She emerged from the 38-minute battle almost miraculously unscathed, having taken only 5 minor hits. But the victory came at a horrific cost. Both Admirals Callahan and Scott were killed on the bridge of the San Francisco. The American force was shattered. Captain Hoover of the Helena found himself the senior surviving officer and ordered the battered remnants to withdraw. It was in the aftermath of this brutal fight that a second, more tragic domino would fall. As the ships limped away, the Japanese submarine I-26 fired a spread of torpedoes. One struck the light cruiser USS Juno. The torpedo hit her magazine and the ship vaporized in a single, apocalyptic explosion. Hoover was now faced with an agonizing command decision. The area was known to be infested with enemy submarines. His remaining ships were damaged, his crews exhausted and traumatized. To stop and search for survivors from the Juno would be to risk his entire remaining force. He made the difficult choice to press on, signaling a passing B-17 bomber about the sinking and requesting it notify command. That message was never delivered. For 8 days, the survivors of the Juno, including the 5 Sullivan brothers, were left to the sharks and the exposure. Of the nearly 700 men aboard, only 10 were ultimately rescued. The ripple effect of this decision was devastating for Captain Hoover. Upon reaching port, a furious Admiral Halsey relieved him of command. Though Halsey would later express regret, acknowledging the immense pressure Hoover was under, the captain's career was ruined. It was a stark lesson in the brutal calculus of command, where the choice to save the many can mean condemning the few, and where the consequences of those choices, right or wrong, are absolute. The Helena had survived 2 of the most vicious naval battles of the war. Her reputation as a technological marvel and a fierce fighter cemented in blood and steel. But the war was far from over, and her greatest trial, the one that would seal her legend, was still to come. Every legend has a final chapter, and for the USS Helena, that chapter was written in fire and water in the Kula Gulf. By mid-1943, the tide in the Solomons had turned. Allied forces were on the offensive, island-hopping, up the chain towards the Japanese stronghold of Rabaul. Helena, now under the command of Captain Charles Cecil, was a veteran, her guns instrumental in pounding Japanese positions on the island of New Georgia. On the night of July 5th, she supported an amphibious landing, unleashing her famous firepower one more time, hurling over 1,000 shells at enemy shore positions. It was a flawless operation, but ominous news arrived the next afternoon. Another Tokyo Express was steaming south, a powerful force of 10 destroyers intent on landing reinforcements. Rear Admiral Walden Ainsworth's task force, with Helena and her sister ships St. Louis and Honolulu, moved to intercept. In the early morning darkness of July 6th, the familiar pattern began to repeat. The American radar picked up the Japanese force, the ships prepared to engage. At 1:57 a.m., the three American cruisers opened fire. It was the moment the machine gun cruiser Legend reached its zenith. In just over 5 minutes, the three ships fired nearly 1,500 6-inch shells. Observers on other vessels described Helena's firing as a continuous stream of flame, like liquid fire squirting from a hose. But here, in her moment of greatest fury, lay the seed of her destruction. In the previous night's bombardment, Helena had expended her entire supply of new flashless powder charges, which were designed to minimize the brilliant muzzle blast of the main guns. She was now firing standard, smokeless powder. With each salvo, enormous blinding flashes of orange-white light illuminated her entire 607-foot length, turning her from a ghostly radar-guided assassin into a perfect, brilliant target against the black canvas of the night sea. The hunter had become the beacon. The Japanese destroyer crews, masters of torpedo warfare, saw their opportunity. Even as they were being battered by the American shelling, they launched their deadly payload of long-lance torpedoes. At 2:03 a.m., just as Admiral Ainsworth ordered a turn, 3 of those torpedoes found the Helena. The first struck near the bow, tearing it almost completely off. Incredibly, even with her forward section shattered, her remaining guns continued to fire. But 2 minutes later, a second and third torpedo slammed into her midships, deep below the waterline, breaking her keel and flooding her engine rooms. The ship lost all power. Her back was broken. Captain Cecil, recognizing the mortal nature of the wounds, gave the order to abandon ship just 4 minutes after the first impact. The mighty Helena, the ship that had survived Pearl Harbor and the inferno of Guadalcanal, buckled in the middle and began to sink. Nearly 1,000 men were thrown into the dark, oil-choked water. This is where the story of the USS Helena transitions from a tale of technology and firepower to one of profound human resilience. The machine was gone, but the spirit of her crew endured. Captain Cecil, refusing rescue himself, took command of a small flotilla of whaleboats, gathering survivors. The destroyers Nicholas and Radford managed to pull hundreds of men from the water before being forced to withdraw by approaching enemy ships and the coming dawn. But over 275 men were left behind. What followed was an odyssey of survival that stands as one of the most remarkable rescue stories of the war. One group of sailors clung to the ship's still-floating bow section. Others drifted on life rafts for days under the scorching sun, battling dehydration, exposure, and sharks. Eventually, currents carried 165 survivors to the shores of Vella La Vella, an island occupied by the Japanese. For these exhausted men, discovery meant certain capture or execution. But they found unlikely allies. The local Solomon Islanders, who had watched the battle from their shores, and a network of allied coast watchers hidden deep in the jungle, sprang into action. At immense personal risk, the islanders found the scattered groups of American sailors before Japanese patrols could. They guided them through dense jungle to hidden camps, providing them with food, water, and most importantly, safety. For over a week, an entire community conspired to protect these strangers from their common enemy. The Coast Watchers radioed the survivors' location back to Guadalcanal, triggering an audacious rescue plan. On the night of July 15th, a fleet of 8 American destroyers raced to Vella La Vella under the cover of darkness. In a flawlessly executed operation, small boats were sent to the beach, evacuating all 165 Helena survivors, along with several Chinese merchants who had helped them and even a downed American pilot. The machine gun cruiser was gone, but her men, through their own tenacity and the courage of strangers, had come home. The legacy of the USS Helena is therefore twofold. First, she was a profound technological lesson. She proved that in the crucible of modern war, the ability to acquire and process information, to see the enemy when they cannot see you, is a decisive, war-winning advantage. Her SG radar was as revolutionary in 1942 as stealth aircraft or drone technology are today. She was the harbinger of an age where battles would be won not just by the force of the explosion, but by the sophistication of the electrons that guided it. This principle of information dominance is the central pillar of modern military doctrine, a direct descendant of the ghostly green blips on Helena's radar screen. But her second, more enduring legacy lies in the human element. The technology gave her an edge, but it was the relentless training of her gunners, the courage of her damage control teams at Pearl Harbor, the impossible choices of her captains, and the incredible will to survive of her crew in the waters of the Kula Gulf that truly defined her. The ship was a weapon, but the crew was its soul. A ship is ultimately just steel, but the bonds forged between those who serve upon it, and even between those sailors and the strangers who risk everything to save them, are what give its story meaning. For 75 years, Helena's final resting place remained a mystery. Then, in 2018, the research vessel Petrel, part of an expedition funded by the late philanthropist Paul Allen, found her. She lay broken in two on the seabed, nearly 3,000 feet down. High-definition cameras swept over her silent form, revealing her hull number, 50, still clearly visible. They confirmed her identity by the unique feature that had made her a legend, the 5 triple turrets that had earned her the name Machine Gun Cruiser. Today, a memorial stands in Helena, Montana. It honors the ship and the men who served her. It bears an inscription that perfectly encapsulates her story, a testament to the enduring bond between a crew and their vessel, a bond that transcends even death and the crushing depths of the sea. It reads, "They are still Helena men, always will be."